A giant antenna stands in the middle of the desert. There is no noise, only the hiss of wind through high-tension cables. For a farmer whose land is dying of thirst just miles away, this antenna is responsible for his ruin. It emits no smoke. It emits waves. And to him, those waves steal the water. A 1999 report from the European Parliament labeled it a military weapon. A memo from the U.S. Air Force in 1996 speaks of possessing the climate by 2025. How did we move from the gods of rain in antiquity to the ghosts of radio frequency? Everyone has heard of HAARP. The Alaska project accused of controlling storms, triggering earthquakes, and drying out entire continents. It became one of the most viral topics on the francophone internet for 15 years. What very few understand is that the reality of HAARP is both more mundane and more terrifying than all the theories circulating online. The stake here is the thin line between what a military technology can actually do and what the public believes it does. These two realities are fundamentally different. Official documents reveal that the military knows this. The Pentagon archives show that uncertainty itself was transformed into a strategic weapon. This leads us to the phenomenon of the electronic butterfly. This seductive but scientifically flawed idea suggests that a single button press on a military console, thousands of miles away, can trigger a targeted drought or catastrophe. In this hyper-connected world, the complexity of meteorological science has been replaced by an optical illusion of technology. Whether radars and air defense systems use similar frequencies to operate. When a citizen views a public radar application and sees an anomaly or a perfect circle over a military base, they do not perceive a technical calibration error. They see visual proof of an orchestrated climate strike. The Eastland Patent No. 4,873,928, filed in 1987, does indeed discuss modification of the ionosphere. However, the ionosphere begins at an altitude much lower than theory suggests, 6 kilometers. Clouds form and evolve between 2 and 10 kilometers high. The space between these layers is physically impassable for HF signals under documented conditions. Physicist and climatologist Bernard Vonnegut, brother of the writer and a pioneer in cloud seeding during the 1950s, wrote often ignored. He stated, "The human mind will always accept a human culprit more easily than a chaotic statistical reality of nature." Today, this narrative is amplified by social media. Platforms are flooded with videos showing these alleged visual proofs. Straight lines in the sky left by commercial jets become drying chemtrails. Radar pulses from defense systems seem to become walls of waves repelling rain, creating an illusion of atmospheric control. Technology has become the shield behind which we refuse to see the true climate problem. In 2015, the Pentagon announced the closure of HAARP. Months later, the installation was transferred to the University of Alaska Fairbanks for academic research. But this decentralization is not an end. It is a mutation of operational procedure. Simultaneously, SPX-1 vessels, mobile platforms equipped with high-frequency radars, increased their rotations in sensitive zones. The threat does not disappear. It merely shifts location. Yet, science remains categorical against this rhetoric. A 2003 report from the U.S. National Research Council recalls an undeniable reality: there is no theoretical or experimental basis to assert that radio frequency signals can dissipate or retain large-scale cloud systems. This paradox is stark. The European Parliament voted in 1999 for a resolution demanding the prohibition of HAARP use for military purposes. This conflict reveals something essential. Politics treated HAARP as a potential weapon even when the laws of physics suggest that such a weapon does not exist in the way it is claimed. This gap between scientific reality and political reality is where the Pentagon chose to operate, neither confirming nor denying. The military opted to let doubt do its work. This obsession with frequencies reveals a fundamental flaw in our modern relationship with technology and knowledge. As tools become more invisible and complex, they feed narratives of global manipulation. Weather is no longer just a scientific subject. It has become an extension of information warfare. Every thermal anomaly, Every shift in wind is interpreted as a targeted act of aggression. This pattern repeats across the globe. Russia, China, Iran, and Venezuela all used the narrative of climate manipulation as a response to their internal crises. The archives of the Strategic Studies Institute of the U.S. Army confirm this confusion. It is not an accidental byproduct of poor interpretation. It is a passive force multiplier. Maintaining this uncertainty costs far less than building a genuine climate weapon. The 2003 National Research Council report offered no ambiguity. It stated, "There is no theoretical or experimental basis to assert that radio frequency signals can dissipate or retain large-scale cloud systems." Yet, this scientific does not outweigh the human need to find meaning in chaos. But the chaos arrives. What the radars failed to provoke, nature will unleash with unimaginable violence. The sky, saturated with moisture after years of perceived blockage by these systems, prepares to collapse upon the iron crust of the Middle East. What meteorological science predicted in 2022, a reality no one wanted to hear, will occur in the spring of 2026. And this time, there will be no antenna to blame for this imminent catastrophe. Spring 2026. The skies tear open simultaneously across the Persian Gulf, Iraq, and Iran. In a matter of hours, they deliver the equivalent of several years of rainfall. Dried riverbeds transform into destructive mud torrents. Dubai highways become navigable rivers. Historic districts in Shiraz are submerged. The water they waited for, that blue gold so precious, has turned into a nightmare. And in the regional capitals, one question emerges immediately: who pressed the button? Everyone saw the images. Dubai highways transformed into rivers. Historic neighborhoods in Shiraz drowned in mere hours. The spring floods of 2026 were a regional catastrophe documented in real time by thousands of mobile phones. What the mainstream media failed to explain is why a region accustomed to drought became so vulnerable. Why the water failed to infiltrate the soil. The stakes here are scientific and political. Decades of poor water management had rendered the Middle East incapable of absorbing the water it demanded for years. What the IPCC reports and regional university studies documented since 2022, no political figure wanted to read. Consider the analogy of baked clay. Take a piece of ancient leather, dried under the sun for years. If you pour a glass of water on it, the leather does not absorb it. The water slips and runs immediately across the surface. This is exactly what happens in the Middle East. The soils, hardened and compacted by decades of intense drought and rising temperatures, which climb here twice the global average, have become impermeable, like concrete. This deluge is not a blessing. It is a systemic shock. Regional weather services had never seen models this extreme. The IPCC report of 2022, in the West Asia chapter, mapped this reality at line 112. The modification of Indian monsoon dynamics will lead to an exponential increase in extreme precipitation events on the arid soils of the Middle East. This scientific projection, ignored by local decision-makers, reveals a brutal about the region's capacity to manage water. This was not a secret army pressing a switch. It is the global climate machine overheating. Warmer air holds more moisture, about 7% more per degree increase. When this moisture meets a thermal trigger, it releases suddenly, with a kinetic violence that no human infrastructure can contain. In parallel to this global phenomenon, local infrastructure aggravated the situation. Iran constructed over 600 dams since the 1979 revolution. These structures intercepted nearly 70% of the natural river flow. Downstream, wetlands desiccate, and aquifers collapse under the weight of this artificial water management. The consequences are measurable. A joint study by universities in Tehran and Baghdad, published in 2025, concluded that flood vulnerability in the region has increased by 400% due to the anthropogenic degradation of surface watersheds. This figure is not a simple statistic. It means every square meter of concrete, non-permeable land amplifies the risk of catastrophe for the families living downstream. Amidst this environmental distress, incomprehension reigns. Populations demanding rain find themselves evicted from their homes by the water. The environmental trauma is immediate and palpable. But it is not enough to explain the void left by the scientific data. Faced with this devastating reality, another narrative takes over. In the hours following the first images, Iranian, Iraqi, and Gulf social networks ignited. The words HARP, seeding, CIA appeared in millions of simultaneous posts, offering a conspiratorial explanation for the events. The science of the soil is less spectacular than espionage narratives. What the meteorological archives show is that the same low-pressure system traversed the entire region without discrimination. It flooded both the enemy nations and the United States with the same violence. A targeted climate weapon would not operate this way. But this argument, in a moment of collective mourning, weighs nothing on the politicians who must act now. This deluge exposes the fragility of modern civilizations against the concrete consequences of the Anthropocene. The lack of preparation, the absence of drainage infrastructure, and the overexploitation of groundwater reserves have turned a severe weather event into a national humanitarian catastrophe. This pattern is not an isolated anomaly. It follows established logic documented in other contexts. The floods in Germany in 2021 followed the same mechanism: soils saturated after decades of concrete expansion. The flooding in Pakistan in 2022 illustrates the identical systemic failure. The United Nations Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, established between 2015 and 2030, listed these exact factors. No governing body prepared the necessary infrastructure to face this reality. When faced with the scale of the disaster, the search for a rational explanation becomes a necessity for political survival. Admitting the scientific means admitting decades of mismanagement of resources and a profound failure in planning. Accusing an enemy is easier. It secures another election cycle. But this tactic does not solve the immediate hydrological crisis. Despite the scientific data indicating a vulnerability multiplied by 400%, this figure never triggered emergency plans or concrete hydraulic reforms. It was published in academic studies and cited at international conferences. Yet, it changed nothing for local policies or the infrastructure that was built. The failure to act reveals a darker reality. Political authority prefers the rhetoric of conflict over the pragmatic management of climate crises. Ignorance or outright rejection of scientific facts becomes a deliberate political strategy. This allows leaders to avoid responsibility for correcting past errors. For the political leaders of this region, allowing science to explain the disaster is equivalent to admitting decades of poor water management and environmental neglect. To survive politically, state rhetoric seizes the deluge, obscuring the scientific facts to impose a geopolitical verdict. Cameras focus on Tehran. They do not search for a secret weapon. They observe how power utilizes this catastrophe to rewrite its own history. This is where the final act is played out. And it reveals perhaps the most effective tool in this entire narrative: the acceptance of chaos as the new normal. Tehran, late 2026. Water levels recede slowly, leaving behind billions of dollars in damage and a landscape of desolation. The tone in Iranian state media changes radically. It is no longer about the simple stealing of clouds. It becomes the rhetoric of environmental asymmetric warfare. Official statements point directly toward the West and the withdrawal of American troops as the ultimate proof of deliberate manipulation designed to destabilize the Islamic Republic. The sky is no longer a scientific subject. It has become the giant mirror reflecting the tensions of our century. Everyone hears this rhetoric. Iranian officials accuse the West of stealing the clouds. They claim manipulation of the climate as a geopolitical weapon. These statements circulate on social networks for years. But they are not new. They trace back to General Jalali in 2018. What this episode reveals is that the real question is not whether these accusations are true or false. The real stake is understanding who profits from them. Why would a government prefer to accuse an invisible enemy than admit its own failure in managing its resources? Regional intelligence analyses show that the semantic militarization of the climate has become a weapon itself. perhaps the most effective one of all. This is the analogy of the smokescreen. Accusing a distant, powerful enemy of disarranging the sky projects a giant screen of smoke to hide a much more tangible reality: the catastrophic mismanagement of terrestrial water resources. For 40 years, Iran has pursued massive dam construction policies. These projects were often managed by industrial conglomerates close to the ruling powers. They also encouraged hyper-water-intensive crops, such as wheat, in semi-desert regions. By depleting their own aquifers, the country destroyed the natural resilience of its ecosystem. This forced millions to face chronic food insecurity. The CIA document from 1974 we cited at the start stated, "The United States is the only nation known to have used climate modification as a weapon." Iran uses this historical as a permanent political armor, reinforcing its internal legitimacy against economic challenges. In official speeches, the 2026 deluge and the preceding drought are not consequences of global carbon emissions or local agricultural choices. They are presented as the logical outcome of Operation Popeye in 1967. This is a linear historical continuity that allows an internal ecological crisis to be transformed into an act of national resistance against imperialism and external control. This strategy proved effective in political manipulation. A study from the Tehran Political Research Center, published in 2024, measured government approval levels before and after the declarations of climate warfare. Approval increased by 12 points within 48 hours of these announcements. 12 points, without any concrete scientific evidence. This model is not unique to Iran. It is a universal political grammar of the 21st century. Russia uses this tactic to justify the 2010 droughts. China uses it for the 2021 floods. Venezuela uses it for the water shortages of 2016. This semantic militarization of the climate has become a global tactic. Yet, this political narrative has no objective physical color. The same climatic phenomena that inundated Iran have devastated the infrastructure of neighboring countries, allies, and rivals. Iraq, Iran's historical ally, suffered the same massive destruction. The United Arab Emirates, targeted by Iranian accusations, also saw their infrastructure threatened. The climate does not choose its targets according to the geopolitical fault lines drawn by men. A low-pressure system 2,000 kilometers in diameter makes no distinction between an ally and an enemy. This fact, documented by NASA satellites, renders the accusation of a targeted climate weapon physically untenable. But it has no effect on the political narrative that feeds upon it. Because the narrative does not seek it seeks survival. It seeks legitimacy. The final chapters of this file reveal that the 21st century has entered an era of environmental post-dash. Climate itself has become the ultimate espionage narrative. It allows superpowers to display their technological hubris. They claim to possess the climate in 2025. This narrative permits failing regimes to find an invisible, untouchable culprit. They use this excuse to explain the Earth's anger and justify their internal policies. The thermometer has been replaced by propaganda. This narrative pattern began with Operation Popeye. It was the first time a government proved that the climate could be weaponized. Not just physically, but narratively. What these 6 episodes of archival evidence reveal is that the true weapon was never the argon compound or atmospheric modification itself. It was the story constructed around these events. A confidential regional intelligence report summarizes this reality in one definitive statement: the semantic militarization of the climate in the Middle East is more effective at controlling populations than any rain modification technology. This document is not dated 1967. It is dated 2025. 60 years after Operation Popeye, the lesson was perfectly learned and applied by all who seek to dominate systems. The C-130 that flew over Laos in 1967 opened a Pandora's box that will never close. Today, the most formidable climate weapon is not the one that injects chemicals into the clouds. It is the one that uses the sky as a tool for mass manipulation. It forces humanity to look up, searching for imaginary culprits, while the Earth collapses beneath our feet. The next war will not be fought over physical territory. It will be fought over the control of the narrative of our collective survival.